In a previous video, I showed you how to take a use case, which was enter a comic book record into a system and turn it into this system sequence diagram. Now, I'd like to create a regular sequence diagram, which is from the perspective of software. So I'm going to go to a lower level of detail. All right, so first I'm going to create a duplicate of this page, and then I'm going to strip off a bunch of this information. All right, so rather than having a single system, I'm going to have a bunch of objects which are going to communicate among one another, and this is going to be from the perspective of software. So I'm going to go down to my sequence diagram symbols and start adding in objects. All right, one of the first things I want to interact with is going to be a UI, so the user interface. And I'll just call this the system. It's part of the system, but it's not the only part of the system now. Another thing I'm going to want here, and I'm going to click on Alt and then drag this over because that makes it easier to create. I'm going to create a controller. And a controller is something that we use in software to pass messages through. So imagine that this is maybe an interface where there's a lot of JavaScript in there, and it's going to pass all of its messages, perhaps through an API to this, which is going to receive the actual messages. And then this will forward it on to wherever it needs to go. Okay, so I'm going to have a controller. Another thing I'm going to need is, and I'm thinking about spacing here because I'm going to run out of space, is I'm going to need a comic. So a comic is like an entity class. It's just a plain old object that contains information about comics when I create a comic book record. Okay, another item I'm going to need is, I'm going to call it a user. This could also be my authentication class or a password class. This is something I'm going to use in order to authenticate the user in the system. It's going to have knowledge of a username and password. And then lastly, I'm going to have something over here. I will call it the comic DB. So this is not an actual database, but this is a class that's going to use SQL statements to communicate with an actual database. Okay, so let's get started. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a lifeline underneath each one of these. Oops. Okay, and I want them to all be the same, so I'm going to highlight those. I'm going to go up here and say dotted line, and then I'm going to say none for end arrow. Okay, so now, if you recall, in order to use one of these, I have to use an activation symbol. I'm going to add an activation symbol here for that, and otherwise, without the activation symbol, that's going to symbolize that it's just available to use. Okay, I'm going to get started with that and add some activation symbols here later on as I get to them. So the first thing that happens with this user is they are going to log in by sending in a username and password. And I'll just abbreviate by saying username and password. Now the UI is just kind of a dumb interface, and it is going to turn around and it is going to call the login with the username and password on the controller. Well, the controller itself also is kind of a dumb traffic controller. It's just going to look for the other class. It's going to do the actual handling of the login, and that happens to be the user over here. So in order to use that class, I'm going to add an activation symbol there, and I'm going to reach right past customer there, and I'm going to say login and username and password. And so what this means is that there's an actual login method here. Let's just say, so I could just leave it like that and say it completed, but just for giggles, I'm going to add on a self call here. And for that, I would actually need to add in an additional symbol. So let's just say that it so it's a little bit easier to see. Hold on, let me move this around a little bit. All right, so let's just say that I did some self-call for another message, or which was validate password. Okay, so, or verify password, either one. Okay, so we'll assume that at the end of this that everything happened nicely. So this method call is ended here and it returns to there. This message call is completed, it returns. So let's just say we're done. We didn't draw the dotted line, but let's just say that all of these method calls on each of these objects all completed, and so now we're ready to go on to the next step. Okay, so if a person's logged in and they want to add a comic, they need to pull up the add comic interface. So let's just say that they're going to click on a button that says in the interface, it will be called select add comic. So we're sending a message here, and it's going to bring up a window. All right, so the next thing I want to do here is do a little self-call. What this is going to do is bring up the add comic window. So I'll have this do a little self-call here. And since this is a GUI, I'll say show comic input screen. And so now we can assume that the control is returned back, and we're looking at the input screen there for the comic information. And now we're finally ready to enter in comic information. So I'm going to reach out to the interface, and I'm just going to type in some information. So I'll call it enter comic, and we'll say that it has the title. And since I don't have enough space here, I'm just going to kind of abbreviate. But let's just say we have the title and the publisher, and then etc. ... Okay, so the UI simply takes that information and says, what do I do with that? Well, I need to pass it on to some software, maybe through an API call. So I'll have it reach out to the controller and also call the enter comic method that exists on there. It receives that information and says, well, what do I do with it? Like, well, I personally don't write to databases and do things like that, but I know how to talk with and interface with the comic class, which would actually be an instance of comic and actually use this information. So let us create a comic object instance that would later then be saved to a database. Okay, so with that, we're going to reach out to comic. Oh, but before we can do that, we're going to need to add an activation symbol since we're using it. Okay, so I'm going to reach out to this, and again, I will call enter comic, but I could also maybe just call it comic or new or something like that. We're going to create a comic object with the title and the publisher name and all the other information that would go there. Okay, so now that the comic book object has been created, what should it do? Well, let's just say that for the inventory at this particular company, we don't want there to be duplicates. And so one of the things we might want to do is check an actual database to see if this entry is a duplicate. So let us reach out from here, and we'll say check for duplicates. And let's just say that it returned and everything went fine. It's not a duplicate, so the very last thing we want to do as part of our use case is we're going to save the comic to the database. And at that point, it would return an acknowledgement. This would return an acknowledgement to here. This method, after this method is completed, it would return. This would then return an acknowledgement to here, and then the UI could return an acknowledgement to the customer, so, or the employee. So I could just use acknowledgement arrows underneath each one of these arrows, but it's just assumed that everything completed the way we've drawn it. Okay, so with this, you are now seeing a software-oriented sequence diagram.